Next, let's talk about adding Web API to existing applications. So here I have a Visual Studio project already open. It's called Counting K's. It's going to be a project that we're using to host some data that users can go ahead and create diaries and have nutritional information, like we saw in the data model earlier in this module. So by default, this project, when we run it, just has a very simple web page, and we're showing some sample results from the database. We're showing foods and then some measures for each food. So we've already got a database, and that database has some data in it that we can deal with. But we don't have an API. That's really the next step in what we want to do. This project not only has a typical ASP.NET MVC controller, it also has data. So we can see that there's a second project called Counting K's Data that is just an entity framework project that has also exposed a repository. And the repository is what we're going to mostly be interacting with. The repository knows how to work with entity framework to push data and to pull data out of the database itself. We won't be doing much with those. We'll assume that most of that code is already written, which it has been. You'll find in the samples, if you're a Pluralsight Plus member, that we're including the baseline project that we're starting from this with. So if you want to build this along with me, you can go ahead and make a copy of that baseline project and then do everything we're about to do. So in order to use Web API, we actually have to add it to this default MVC project. We can do this by using NuGet. If you don't already have NuGet as an add-in, you're going to want to go to the extensions for your Visual Studio and add it as an extension. Most of you are probably already using it, so I won't belabor what it does. And if I look for Web API, we're going to see the Web API core library or just Microsoft ASP.NET Web API. This is the complete package for what you're going to want to add it to an existing website. So I'm just going to press install, and it's going to resolve a number of dependencies to bring them in, and I will have to agree to the licenses. Now that we have Web API created, we're going to see if we open global ASAX that we're going to have a new line for Web API.register, just like the brand new project did. And if we navigate there, we're going to see that same registration file. One thing to note is that what you're getting here in the adding Web API is a bit different than what you're getting in a new Web API project. There's some missing pieces. The new Web API project includes things like automatic documentation and such that you may be interested in looking at how to implement, but there isn't a NuGet package that will just stuff this into an existing project because there's a little too much involved for a NuGet package to just start adding a bunch of views and adding an area and all sorts of other small intricacies. So this is going to assume that you're going to be adding just the API itself to your project. Another thing to note is that we have commented out this enable query support. So this is an optional support you can get in Web API to be able to expose an iQueryable endpoint. And the benefit to this is to allow you to expose your data from a Web API as OData feeds. Now, if you're not familiar with OData, it's a way to allow you to more expressively query across the wire. It's an open standard that was pioneered by Microsoft, and it's very useful for line of business sort of scenarios or where both sides are going to be somewhat Microsoft-centric. There are libraries for a number of different devices and platforms like Java, iOS, Android, etc. But I find that when I'm building an API for general consumption for developers, that it tends to be a little confusing for them, and that building a standard REST-based API is what we're going to focus on, so we're going to leave this commented out. We're not going to support querying over the wire. You might want to read more on what this means after you view this course, but we're going to focus on building a standard RESTful API that returns JSON or XML. So now let's build our first controller.